The chandeliers of the Sterling Ballroom glittered like captured constellations, their golden light spilling across a sea of silk gowns and tailored tuxedos. Outside Manhattan pulsed with its usual restlessness. Still inside this gilded hall, time seemed to pause, holding its breath for the evening spectacle, the wedding, with the entire elite of New York whispering in awe. It wasn't just a union of two powerful families. Tonight was meant to be a coronation, a performance of legacy, wealth, and beauty so precise it could rival an opera. White roses cascaded from crystal vases, violins lilted through the air, and champagne glasses gleamed in the hands of those who ruled the city from boardrooms and penthouses. Yet tension simmered beneath the shimmer and champagne thin as glass, sharp as diamonds. When the tall oak doors opened, a hush rippled through the ballroom. Alexander Sterling and Adrian Sterling entered side by side. The twins, identical in form, but not in essence, commanded the room without needing to speak. Alexander the elder, by minutes, wore power like a second skin. His presence was magnetic. His dark hair swept back with effortless elegance, his eyes the kind of blue that seemed to measure and own everything they touched. Where Alexander stepped, people instinctively parted, as though recognizing an unseen crown upon his head. Adrian, by contrast, was all quiet fire. He carried the same striking face and broad shoulders, yet there was an intensity in his gaze that was unsettled rather than dazzled. While Alexander charmed with polished ease, Adrian smoldered his silence weightier than words, his movements precise, almost too exact, like a man always on guard. Together they were a vision of wealth and power. But for those watching closely, something was between them, an unspoken tension, a taut wire that threatened to snap. Then came Amara and Ayla. Amara entered first, her gown, a whisper of ivory silk, delicate yet regal. She carried herself with grace that seemed to hush even the murmurs of the ballroom. Her beauty wasn't ostentatious. It was the kind that lingered, that drew the gaze and held it, like the calm of a hidden lake under moonlight. Yet her eyes, deep perceptive, betrayed a mind that missed nothing, a heart that felt too much. Behind her came Ayla, brighter, bolder, a spark to Amara's quiet flame. Her gown shimmered with faint silver threads that caught the chandelier light, scattering it in playful fragments. Ayla's laughter was the kind that turned heads. Her confidence was a magnet. But tonight, as she stepped into the ballroom, her smile trembled for just a fraction of a second, as though she too sensed the undercurrent of unease that laced the air. The ballroom seemed to pulse when the sisters' paths crossed with the Sterling twins. Amara's eyes met Adrian's. Something silent passed between them, raw and electric, as though the air shifted. Neither smiled, but neither looked away. Ayla's gaze found Alexander's. Unlike her sister, she did smile, soft, hesitant, then bolder, as Alexander's lips curved in the faintest of acknowledgments. The gala's opulence fell away for a heartbeat, leaving only two figures in their own world. It should have been the perfect symmetry. Twin brothers, twin sisters, fate, weaving its threads with precision. But fate, as always, had darker hands at work. The music swelled, and couples began to glide across the polished marble floor. Servers circulated with trays of champagne, laughter rang like crystal bells, and the illusion of perfection spun tighter around the guests. That was when Ayla noticed him. A man stood utterly still across the crowd, near one of the marble columns. He wore a black suit, not unusual for the evening, but there was something in how he held himself too rigid and watchful. His face was partly shadowed, yet his eyes never left Alexander. Ayla's laughter faltered mid-sentence. She blinked, glancing away, only to find his gaze locked, still, unyielding, cold. And then, Just as quickly as she noticed him, he was gone. She turned sharply, scanning the ballroom, but the spot was empty. The crowd moved like nothing had happened, but Ayla's pulse quickened. She could still feel his stare lingering like frost on her skin. When she looked again, a waiter placed a small ivory envelope on Alexander's plate. No one seemed to notice. No one but Adrian. Adrian's eyes flicked to the envelope, and in that instant, the mask he wore cracked. His face, usually composed and unreadable, drained of color. He stiffened, a faint tremor in his hand as he reached for his glass, but didn't drink. Amara saw it. She hadn't meant to, but her seat gave her a perfect view of Adrian's reaction. She followed his gaze to the envelope resting innocuously beside Alexander's untouched champagne flute. Something shifted inside her. Danger. The word wasn't spoken, but wrapped around her like a whisper. She could feel the way Adrian's jaw tightened, and his eyes darkened, not with confusion, but recognition. He knew. He knew what the envelope meant. Alexander, oblivious, or perhaps too confident, hadn't noticed yet. He was laughing with Ayla, his hand brushing hers on the table, their chemistry sparking enough to draw glances from nearby guests. But Adrian noticed, and Amara noticed Adrian. The night continued, but the illusion had cracked for Amara, Ayla, and Adrian. Every laugh seemed too sharp, every cheer forced every shadow too dark. The chandeliers still gleamed. The orchestra still played, but beneath the opulence, something poisonous coiled. Ayla leaned toward Amara, her smile fixed, but her voice low. "Did you see him? The man in black." Amara blinked. "You saw him too." Ayla nodded, her hand tightening around her champagne flute. He was watching Alexander, and then gone. Their eyes flickered both toward the envelope. Adrian's hand covered it now, his fingers pressing it flat against the tablecloth, as if to hide it and contain whatever storm it carried. His expression was unreadable again, but his skin remained pale, his jaw tight. Amara knew without understanding how that this night was no longer simply about vows and champagne. Something had shifted. The wedding was the stage, but the play had a darker script. Later, when Alexander finally picked up the envelope, drawn to it with idle curiosity, Adrian was quick. Too quick. His hand intercepting. "Business," Adrian murmured, slipping it into his jacket before Alexander could protest. "Nothing worth spoiling tonight." Alexander raised a brow, amused, then returned his attention to Ayla, who was radiant under his gaze. To him, the world was still glittering unshaken. But for Adrian and Amara, the truth was clear. The glitter was only a veil. In the shadows of Manhattan, danger had been invited to the wedding somewhere, and it had RSVP'd. The chandeliers burned brighter, mocking the darkness gathering at the edges of the night. The vows, the laughter, the dance, all of it would go on. But the story had already shifted course, and none of them, not Alexander, with his easy charm, not Ayla with her bright smile, not Adrian with his pale grip on a secret, and not Amara with her quiet intuition, would leave this wedding unchanged. The city outside roared with life, but destiny had already drawn its blade inside the ballroom. The ballroom glowed with chandeliers, spilling light like liquid gold, their crystal facets scattering fragments of brilliance across polished marble floors. Laughter and champagne bubbled in tandem, violins hummed in a symphony that wove seamlessly with the hushed conversations of New York's elite. It was the kind of evening that demanded beauty and perfection. For most, it was precisely that. But not for everyone. Amara stood near the edge of the dance floor, her gown a sweep of midnight satin, her presence quiet, yet magnetic. While couples twirled and guests whispered about fortunes and mergers, her eyes drifted not toward the stage where the string quartet played, nor toward the towers of roses that flanked the hall, but toward Adrian. There was something taut about him tonight, a pull in the line of his jaw, a tension flickering beneath his polished smile. She had noticed it earlier, when Alexander had leaned close to whisper something in his brother's ear. Adrian's hand had stilled around his glass of bourbon, and for the briefest moment his mask had cracked. Amara wasn't sure why she had caught it, perhaps because she was attuned to fractures, to the almost invisible seams where perfection threatened to split. Across the room, Ayla floated like a flame. Her dress was the color of dawn blush silk that clung and shimmered with each step. Guests gravitated toward her, entranced by her easy laughter and luminous grace. Yet she too carried a secret weight. The vision of the man in the black suit, his gaze fixed on Alexander, the envelope slipped into his hand, and then his vanishing act haunted her. She hadn't told anyone. Not yet. But her eyes kept scanning the crowd, searching for his shadow. Alexander oblivious, or pretending to be played his part with perfection. The favored twin, the golden heir, his smile polished enough to hide entire histories. He raised a glass, made a toast glittering with charm, and pulled laughter from the room as though he owned it. Yet Ayla noticed how often his eyes flicked toward his brother, as though tethered by something unseen. And Adrian. Oh, Adrian kept his distance. His touch was careful, but cold when he danced with partners introduced by powerful families. When he smiled, it never reached his eyes. And when at last he slipped away to the edge of the balcony, Amara found herself following, without knowing why. The night air was sharp, carrying the faint tang of the Hudson and the sweeter scent of roses drifting from the garden below. Adrian leaned against the balustrade, cigarette glowing faintly in his hand, though he didn't smoke it. He seemed more like a man clutching a lifeline than indulging in a habit. Amara said softly, "That you don't belong out here alone," surprising herself as much as him. He turned startled, then smiled, thin-guarded. "Neither do you." Something in his tone prickled at her. It wasn't an accusation, but recognition, as though he understood why she had followed him without spoken words. She should have turned back and offered a polite excuse, but she didn't. Instead, she stepped closer, her heels clicking lightly on stone. "I saw how you looked earlier," she said quietly, "when your brother held that envelope." His expression shifted, subtle but undeniable shock first, then calculation, then something darker. "You notice too much," he murmured. "And you hide too much," she countered. Silence stretched between them for a heartbeat, woven with the hum of distant music and the muffled laughter spilling from the ballroom. Adrian's eyes, darker than Alexander's, brighter blue, seemed to weigh her measure, her as though deciding whether she was an ally or a danger. Finally, he exhaled smoke curling into the night like a secret unfurling. "Some envelopes shouldn't be opened." Her pulse quickened. "But they already have, haven't they?" He didn't answer, and that was answer enough. Inside, the rhythm of the night swelled. Ayla, growing restless, slipped away from the glittering throng. She had always been attuned to atmospheres, to shifts in the air. Tonight it pressed against her skin, heavy, unsettling. She moved past servers carrying trays of champagne flutes, past business people with shark-like grins, until she found herself near the side corridor leading to the mansion's service wing. It was quieter here, the walls lined with portraits of ancestors long gone. And there, resting on a console beneath a gilded mirror, lay another envelope, plain cream-colored, sealed in crimson wax. Her heart thudded. This wasn't a chance. Her fingers brushed it as Alexander's reflection appeared in the mirror behind her. "You shouldn't touch that." His voice was low, almost a whisper. Startled, Ayla spun, clutching the envelope to her chest. His eyes, like Adrian's, yet colder, met hers with unnerving calm. "Why not?" she asked. "Because once you do," he said, stepping closer, "you're part of it." She swallowed. Part of what? He smiled then, but it wasn't charming. It was sharp, dangerous, like glass beneath silk, something you can't unknow. For a moment, she considered handing it over, letting him reclaim whatever this secret was. But something in her stubborn and unyielding refused. Perhaps it was the way his gaze carried not warning, but control, as though he assumed obedience. So she slipped the envelope into the folds of her dress. "Maybe that's exactly what I want to know." His smile faltered. Only for a second, but it was enough. Adrian had not moved back on the balcony, though Amara lingered beside him. He stared at the skyline, the city glittering with promise and ruin. "You think I'm weak, don't you?" he said suddenly. She blinked. "Why would I? Because I let him hold all the light. Because Alexander shines, and I—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "I stand in the shadows." There was pain in his words. Yes, but also defiance. Amara stepped closer, her voice barely above the wind. "Sometimes, shadows see more than the light ever will." He looked at her, then truly looked, as though no one had ever spoken to him like that. For the first time that evening, something in him softened. Vulnerability flickered raw and unguarded, and Amara felt it tug at her in a way she hadn't expected. But before either could speak again, hurried footsteps broke the moment. A staff member appeared, flustered, whispering something into Adrian's ear. His face drained of color, his cigarette slipping forgotten from his fingers. "What is it?" Amara asked. Adrian's eyes darted toward the ballroom doors, then back to her. "Stay here," he ordered too sharply before disappearing inside. Amara's instincts screamed otherwise. She didn't stay. Inside, chaos simmered beneath the surface elegance. Waiters whispered. Security moved discreetly and near the far wall. Ayla stood stiffly, the hidden envelope heavy against her ribs. Alexander was gone from sight. Adrian strode across the room, his jaw set, scanning for something or someone. And then, in the hush between two music notes, a single champagne glass shattered. The ballroom stilled, not for the sound itself, but for what followed: a streak of crimson blooming against white marble too vivid to be wine. Gasps rippled, guests froze. Somewhere, someone screamed. And just like that, the glittering illusion of the evening cracked wide open. The first autumn rain fell softly against the windows of the small clinic, a gentle percussion that echoed through its quiet corridors. The scent of antiseptic lingered, clean, but faintly bitter, like unspoken truths hidden in the air. Ayla stood at the reception desk, eyes scanning the evening's schedule. Another long day. Another list of patients who needed her patience and her voice of calm. Yet her mind was not entirely here. For weeks, she had carried an unfamiliar presence, like the faint echo of a song she couldn't forget. Alexander. The stranger who had arrived so unassumingly blended into her days with a warmth she hadn't expected. He carried an air of simplicity in the way he smiled, in the way he asked about her work, in the gentle pauses that let her speak without interruption. But what lingered most was how his gaze often seemed to hold more than he said, as though beneath his calm exterior stretched entire oceans of secrets. What Ayla did not know was that Alexander's every visit to the clinic was threaded with purpose. Hidden beneath his soft words and easy gestures lay a web of questions he was chasing. Her world, so ordinary on the surface, brushed against the edges of one he had sworn to expose. His investigation had begun months ago, tracing threads of corruption tied to a network of illicit finances, whispered names, and shadowy transactions. It had unexpectedly led him to this modest clinic, that offered healing and refuge. And to Ayla, whose kindness seemed untouched by the darker truths curling in the shadows around her. At first, she had been a point of observation. Now she was becoming something else entirely. The one person who softened his guarded instincts, who reminded him of the humanity he risked losing in the endless chase for justice. Meanwhile, Adrian moved with practiced ease through another part of the clinic. His latest patient was a young boy brought in by a charity foundation. The child's laughter was brittle, interrupted by coughing that rattled his fragile frame. Adrian bent down his white coat, brushing against the boy's blanket, and whispered encouragement that sounded like promises. Amara, standing close by, watched with admiration. Adrian carried himself with a calm born not of indifference, but of resilience. His work was not for recognition, nor was it for reward. It was for the quiet satisfaction of knowing someone somewhere would breathe easier because he had been there. Their partnership, forged in the quiet intensity of shared responsibility, had grown into a rhythm. She anticipated his requests before he voiced them. He trusted her to notice what others missed. Between them, an unspoken harmony existed, subtle and unpretentious. And in that harmony, something delicate began to stir, though neither dared to name it aloud. Nights blurred into days, and Alexander and Ayla's encounters multiplied in that blur. He often arrived with the excuse of checking records, asking about charitable initiatives, and inquiring about her thoughts on the clinic's outreach. His questions seemed harmless, almost idle, yet they carried the precision of a man who never wasted words. Ayla, who was used to people passing quickly through her life, began waiting for his presence. His footsteps in the hallway lifted something inside her. His voice, low and even, threaded itself into her memory. She began to imagine him not just as a visitor, but as a figure who belonged in the mosaic of her days. It was absurd, she told herself. She knew almost nothing about him. He said little of his past, nothing of his family, and even his profession remained vague. Consulting he had mentioned once, but the word hung empty like a mask that hid more than it revealed. Still, there was no denying the pull she felt. One evening, fate drew the curtain wider. Ayla had agreed to attend a community fundraising dinner, a modest event held in the ballroom of a hotel decorated with wilting roses and earnest speeches. She had dressed in her navy dress, modest yet graceful, her hair pinned in a way that made her look almost fragile. She hadn't expected Alexander to be there. Yet when she turned toward the entrance, her breath caught. He arrived not as the quiet man she knew, but as someone else entirely. A black car with tinted windows had pulled up outside. Two men in dark suits stepped out first, scanning the area with eyes sharp and alert. Then Alexander emerged, his stride unhurried, his presence commanding without effort. Behind him another car followed, its headlights glinting like watchful eyes. It was not just his arrival that stunned her. It was how people reacted. The host hurried forward, bowing his head with nervous respect. Conversations hushed, as eyes turned following his every step, as though the room had shifted around him. Ayla froze, her heart stumbling. This was not the man who lingered by her desk asking about patients. This was someone who carried influence, power, and protection. Someone whose life did not belong in the quiet simplicity he had shown her. He spotted her almost instantly. For a moment his eyes softened, as though he had shed the armor of his arrival and returned to the man she knew. He easily crossed the room, his guards keeping a discreet distance, and stopped just before her. "Ayla," he said gently, his voice carrying both familiarity and something unspoken. She forced a smile, but suspicion coiled in her chest. "You didn't tell me you'd be here. There are commitments I can't always explain." His reply was careful, too careful. Her gaze flicked to the suited men lingering at the edge of the ballroom. "Commitments that come with an escort." He hesitated. Their silence weighted with all the truths he could not reveal. his investigation, his hidden identity, the empire of shadows he was entangled in. None of it could be laid bare here. Not yet. I'll explain. When the time is right, he said in the end. But Ayla, though, touched by the softness in his tone, felt the tremor of doubt. If he had lied about who he was, or worse, concealed it, what else might he be hiding? The night carried on, but the fracture lingered. Alexander, though always close enough to reassure her, was pulled away often by whispers, handshakes, and subtle negotiations that seemed to revolve around him. Ayla watched silent, her heart caught between fascination and fear. When the evening ended, he approached her again, offering to walk her out. The guards melted into the background as he did so, but she still felt their presence pressing against her thoughts. Ayla, he said softly as the rain fell once more outside. Please trust me. Her lips parted, but no words came. Trust. It was a fragile bridge, and she wasn't sure whether stepping onto it would lead her toward light or plunge her into shadows. And yet, despite her doubts, she could not deny the warmth that lingered when he touched her hand. The warmth that whispered of something more than secrets, more than deception. Something dangerously close to love. Elsewhere, Adrian walked Amara home under the glow of street lamps. The night was incredible. The city's hum softened into something almost gentle. You were brilliant today, she said, breaking the silence. He glanced at her surprised. I only did what anyone would. Not everyone, she replied firmly. You listen. You see, that's not common, Adrian. The words struck deeper than she intended. He had always been the quiet observer who carried burdens without asking for recognition. Yet with Amara, he felt something shift. Her acknowledgement was not flattery. It was truth, and it touched the parts of him he kept hidden. Their steps slowed, neither wishing for the night to end too soon. And in that unhurried walk, the fragile beginnings of something profound began to take shape not in declarations, but in the silence that spoke louder than words. As autumn deepened, two threads wound tighter, one woven of secrets and half-truths, the other of trust and small acts of care. Alexander's world of shadows threatened to consume the fragile bond he shared with Ayla. Adrian's quiet strength drew Amara nearer with every passing day. But beneath it all, one truth remained: unshakable love, whether born in secrecy or in light, had a way of finding its path. It glimmered even in the darkest corners, fragile, resilient, and impossible to silence. The suburban road at sunset was usually peaceful, with the tree canopies casting shadows over the long stretch of pavement, the evening breeze gently carrying the scent of dry grass. But that day, peace seemed to vanish, leaving behind a precarious void, as if foreshadowing a coming disaster. A luxurious black car sped along the road. Alexander sat in silence inside the cabin, his gray-blue eyes staring out the window, while his mind was tangled like threads. He was far too familiar with tense operations, billion-dollar deals, or even political conspiracies hidden behind the scenes. But never before had he felt such unease in his heart. For with each passing day, he was drawn deeper into Ayla's gentle gaze and sincere voice. He knew sooner or later she would discover he was not a normal man. And when the truth came out, would she forgive him, or would she choose to walk away? Lost in thought, the driver suddenly stiffened, his eyes flashing tensely. Mr. Alexander, it seems. There's a car following us. Alexander lifted his gaze, looking into the rearview mirror. Indeed, an unlicensed black SUV was approaching at an abnormal speed. His seasoned instincts, honed from countless encounters with the underworld, immediately told him this was no coincidence. Keep the wheel steady. His voice was cold, his eyes flashing with a dangerous light. But before they could react, the SUV suddenly rammed hard into the side of the car. The screech of colliding metal rang out sharply, and Alexander's car swerved violently. The driver tried to regain control, but the pursuers continued charging forward, as if intent on shoving him down the slope by the roadside. Everything happened in an instant. A brutal impact sent the car spinning out of control, crashing straight into the shoulder. Windows shattered, white smoke billowed from the hood. Ayla had just finished her shift at the hospital, on a nearby street still carrying the small medical bag she often used when rushing to emergency patients. The familiar evening road suddenly echoed with terrifying sounds, the screech of brakes, the crash of metal, then a loud explosion. She turned around, her heart nearly stopping, when she saw a car overturned, black smoke rising high. The instinct of a doctor and the courage of her heart told her she could not stand still. Without hesitation, Ayla dashed toward the wreck. The acrid smell of gasoline engulfed her, hot metal groaning, as if ready to explode. "Is anyone still inside?" she shouted. But only the evening wind answered. Bending down through the haze of smoke, she spotted a familiar figure unconscious in the back seat. His hair was slightly disheveled, and his handsome face was pale from blood loss. Ayla's heart clenched. It was Alexander. No time to question why he was here, or why so many bodyguards lay motionless on the road. The only thing she knew, she had to save him. The smoke thickened. Ayla's throat burned. Her eyes stung, but her trembling hands kept pulling at the door handle. It was jammed tight. She risked everything, grabbing a nearby iron bar to pry it open. The door gave way with a crack, scorching heat blasting against her skin. She slipped her arms in, dragging Alexander out. He was heavier than she expected, but perhaps the strength of life and death urgency gave Ayla endurance she didn't know she had. She pulled him away, just in time. Seconds later, the gas tank exploded, flames erupting into the sky. Ayla's heart pounded, sweat mixing with tears, but her hands still shook as she checked his pulse. Thankfully, there was still a heartbeat. "Alexander, can you hear me? It's Ayla. Wake up." Her voice was hoarse, trembling as she shook him, biting her lip to keep calm. His eyelashes fluttered. Alexander opened his eyes, his blurred gaze slowly sharpening. Seeing Ayla's worried face so close, his heart ached, not only from pain, but from an indescribable stirring. "Ayla." His voice was raspy, weak. "Why are you here? Don't say anything. You've lost blood. I need to stop the bleeding now." She was resolute, pulling gauze from her medical bag, her practiced hands tending the wound on his arm. Meanwhile, Alexander watched her intently, his heart surging with an unfamiliar feeling. This small woman had just braved fire and death to save him, a courage greater than that of many men he had known. In that moment, Alexander understood one truth: love could not continue if he kept hiding who he truly was. Lies, even when meant to protect, were only chains. Fragile trust would eventually shatter. That night, once discreetly brought into the mansion for treatment, Alexander lay quietly in the luxurious room. Outside, bodyguards and private doctors watched. No one could enter. Yet he made one request: for Ayla to stay. She sat beside his bed, her worried gaze following his every breath. Her small hand unconsciously clasped his cold one, giving him warmth. "Ayla," he called softly, his voice like a whispering breeze. "You need rest. Don't speak." She replied, though her eyes flickered with confusion. He looked deeply into her, his gray blue eyes burning with the feelings he had long concealed. "There are things I should have told you earlier. I am not an ordinary man, Ayla. Everything you've seen is only a fragment of my real life." Ayla froze, her grip tightening. "Who are you, Alexander?" The moment was drowned in silence. Outside, The night wind brushed through the rose garden, carrying a delicate fragrance. Inside their eyes, met one filled with secrets, the other with worry. Alexander closed his eyes briefly, gathering courage. Today's accident proved that darkness could descend at any moment, stealing him away. And if he kept hiding, he would never know true love. Tonight, he decided. The truth must be revealed, even if it hurts her, or shatters their fragile bond. And Ayla, her heart trembling with each beat, knew her life would change forever. The music was bustling, crystal lights sparkling in the luxurious hall. The charity party of a prestigious medical corporation gathered the most powerful figures in the city: politicians, business people, scholars. Everyone blended into the elegant atmosphere, glasses of wine, glistening laughter echoing. In that crowd, Adrian still kept his usual composure. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit, his sharp eyes distant, as if observing more than enjoying. He never liked these kinds of parties, but duty required his presence. His elegant exterior concealed a heart always prepared to face danger. Amara was different. She entered with a group of colleagues, her simple emerald dress highlighting her grace. She was not the center of attention, but anyone who looked closely would see in her a gentle radiance. For Amara, the party was not a place for show, but an opportunity to seek more funding for poor patients. She had no idea fate had skillfully arranged for her to play such an important role. When the program reached the main speeches, Adrian held a glass of red wine, raising it lightly out of courtesy. A few handshakes, some toasts, he responded with a polite smile. But after just one small sip, a stabbing pain spread from his throat down to his stomach. His vision darkened briefly, and sweat beaded on his forehead. His heart raced wildly. His breath grew rapid. Adrian tightened his grip on the glass, the dark red liquid spilling like blood onto his fingers. His entire body swayed, and he managed only a few staggering steps before collapsing onto the cold marble floor. The entire hall erupted in chaos. Cries of alarm rose, a few people shouted, and instruments fell silent. Every gaze turned to the unconscious man, his lips turning blue. In that moment, Amara felt like she was being pulled by fate. Without hesitation, she rushed forward, kneeling beside Adrian. "Call an ambulance immediately. He's been poisoned." Amara's voice rang clear, cutting through the noise. She tilted his head, checked his breathing, then pressed 2 fingers to his neck. Irregular, slow, and fading. Under the glaring lights, she realized that every passing second was the fragile line between life and death. Adrian was rushed to the hospital in a frantic escort. Black, unmarked cars appeared from nowhere, but Amara cared only about one thing: keeping his heart beating. In the emergency room, she put on her white coat, hair neatly tied, her eyes entirely focused. This was not just a patient, it was a battle against death. Her colleagues looked at her with absolute trust. One doctor shouted, "Heart rate dropping fast. Prepare adrenaline. Start an IV line immediately. I need to recheck my blood pressure and the result in 30 seconds." Everything happened in urgent breaths. Adrian lay on the table, his face pale, lips drained of their usual vitality. Her fingers pressed firmly against his chest, pumping with a determined rhythm. Sweat streamed down her cheeks, but Amara's gaze did not waver. In that moment, she saw how fragile humans truly were. No matter how powerful that man was, now just a life dangling above an unseen abyss. The needle pierced his skin, and the drug pushed into his veins. A wait that seemed endless. No response. A nurse reported anxiously. Amara clenched her hands, took a deep breath, and continued chest compressions. Each push was as though she poured her entire heart into his chest. "You have to come back. Do you hear me? Don't give up," she whispered, her voice hoarse. A sudden beep sounded, the heart rate spiking on the monitor. The room exhaled in relief. Adrian opened his eyes, blurry and weak, but alive. Amara stepped back, her hands trembling, her heart pounding as if it had weathered a storm. Her colleagues patted her shoulder, but she only quietly looked at the patient, her eyes moist. As the hospital corridor sank into stillness that night, Amara sat by the bedside. Adrian slept deeply, his breathing steadier. The golden light fell across his face, revealing a fragility different from his usual firmness. She did not understand why her heart ached so much. This man, whom she had only met a few times, had drawn out all her will between life and death. When his eyes half opened, a raspy voice emerged. "You saved me." Amara nodded gently, answering with a soft smile. "You still owe life a second chance. Please don't waste it." Adrian looked at her for a long time. In his eyes, there was gratitude and something more profound, an invisible thread slowly binding two souls. News of the poisoning spread quickly, and the press only reported briefly. A guest collapsed, fortunately survived. But Amara knew this was no accident. As she stepped into the hallway, she saw a strange man quietly leaving the hospital area. His pace was brisk. His face concealed his glance toward her cold and sharp. Instinct told her the hand that had dealt the poison was still nearby. Inside the room, Adrian kept his eyes shut, but was not asleep. He recalled the shimmering wine, the slightly unusual taste. He knew he was not mistaken. Someone had intended to end him. And amidst all that chaos, the image of Amara leaning over to save him became the only light breaking the darkness. When he awoke the next day, Adrian saw Amara writing medical records at the desk. The room was quiet, only the sound of pen against paper. "You didn't go home to rest?" he asked. Amara looked up, smiling. "A doctor doesn't leave a patient until she's sure they're safe. Besides, I want to make sure you don't develop complications." In that calm answer, Adrian felt a warmth he hadn't known in a long time. He had lived among schemes, calculations, and shadows all his life. But now, a woman stayed up all night for him, not for gain, but simply for his life. His heart, long encased in steel, stirred faintly. In the morning light filtering through the window, Adrian murmured, "Amara, I owe you my life. I will never forget." She looked at him, her eyes serene yet filled with depth. "I don't need you to remember a debt. I only hope you live true to the second chance you've been given." Her words echoed in his mind. For the first time, he no longer felt like a man standing on the edge of power, but simply a human being needing salvation. And that thread, however fragile, carved itself deep into his heart, making him realize that from now on, Amara would never again be just an ordinary doctor in his eyes. New York at night stretched out in lights like a magnificent painting. The skyscrapers reflected countless colors, and the flow of people was still bustling without pause. But the atmosphere was heavy with suffocation in the highest penthouse of a luxurious glass tower. Ayla sat curled up by the window, her deep brown eyes gazing at the city. Amara quietly placed her hand on the table, her finger unconsciously tapping in rhythm with a hurried heartbeat. Adrian and Alexander were in front of the two women, but they no longer seemed like the men they knew. Their eyes were determined, mixed with fear, something rarely seen in those proud gazes. "It's time," Adrian broke the silence. His voice was hoarse, as if each word were a knife cut. "We can't hide it from you anymore." Amara looked up, her eyes widening as if unable to believe what she just heard. "Hide." What Alexander glanced briefly at Adrian, then sighed. His face trembled slightly, but his gaze remained firm. "Amara, Ayla, we are not just ordinary men, not just two people who accidentally walked into your lives. We are the heirs of White Empire. The room fell silent. Even the sound of the wind outside seemed to stop. Ayla laughed, but her voice trembled. White Empire, the most powerful financial corporation in New York. Don't tell me this is a joke. I'm not joking, Adrian answered shortly. Everything you've seen, from Alexander's accident to me being poisoned, is all connected to our inheritance. There is a force that wants to end it, before we can take the seat of power. Amara's heart raced. She had heard of White Empire, a name that when mentioned was enough to make the business world of Europe and America tremble. An empire spanning industries, banking, technology, real estate, healthcare, and the White brothers were the ones who would inherit the entire empire. So, Amara choked, we're outsiders in your story. Alexander stepped closer to Ayla, his eyes glowing with urgency. No, you will never be outsiders. But I was afraid. If you knew the truth, you would leave me. I was worried this distance would turn into an abyss. Ayla turned away, a hot tear rolling down her cheek. Do you think I'm stupid, Alexander? That distance has always existed? You're white. I'm a woman of color. You inherit an empire. I'm an ordinary girl living off a meager salary. But I stayed. Because I believed in you, not the title. The air was taut like a stretched string. All four of them sank into different fears. Fear of loss. Fear of separation. Fear that the cruel truth would erase everything they had just built. Adrian coughed lightly, his body still weak after the poisoning. Amara immediately rushed over to support him. You need to rest, Adrian. Don't push yourself to speak. But he shook his head, his hand gripping hers tightly, seeking an anchor. No. Amara, I need you to understand. These past days, I realized how significant your presence is. I once thought I could stand alone against everything. But when death approached, you were the only one I thought of. Amara froze. Those words made her heart tremble with both fear and pain. She looked deep into his eyes. The ash-gray eyes darkened, yet shimmering with sincerity. Adrian, the distance between us. That distance only exists if you let it exist, he cut in. I can't force you, but I know one thing. I have no reason to go on without you. The atmosphere settled. At that moment, Amara and Ayla understood that their choices would change everything, not just for love, but also for the future, facing dark forces. Alexander squeezed Ayla's hand tightly, his eyes shining with determination. We've decided. No more running, no more hiding. We'll investigate and discover who was behind the accident and the poisoning. But I need to know, are you ready to walk with me, even if the road ahead is stained with blood and tears? Ayla looked at him, her lips trembling but her eyes shining. I once ran into fire to pull you out of an exploding car. Should I stop now? A nod heavy with meaning. And then the four gazes met, like a silent pact, a new beginning. That night, the four of them sat together at Adrian's desk. Thick files, roadmaps, and confidential reports were spread everywhere. Amara flipped through photos, evidence collected around Alexander's car accident scene. A strange detail caught her eye. The brake marks were too short for the speed. Someone tampered with the braking system, she said slowly. Adrian nodded. I thought so too. It wasn't a random accident. Ayla remained silent, but her hands clenched white. The image of Alexander in the burning car flashed in her mind, and her heart clenched tight. As for the poisoning, Amara switched to another file. The poison was mixed in the wine. The waiter that night disappeared without a trace. Alexander frowned. Someone arranged it all. And surely they're not just targeting one of us, but the entire White Empire. Their four eyes met. Once again they felt small before a game too large. But at the same time they knew that only together could they move forward. When Amara stepped out onto the balcony to breathe, Adrian quietly followed. The moonlight fell on her face, glistening in her eyes like a lake. He stood beside her, watching silently, then whispered, "Are you afraid?" Amara didn't turn back. "Who wouldn't be afraid, Adrian? I don't belong in your world. I'm just a doctor, a woman of color in this city. Do you know how many prejudiced looks I've endured? And now, I'm standing next to the heir of white empire. That distance, it suffocates me." He didn't hesitate, touching her shoulder, pulling her to face him. "I don't care about the distance. I only know one thing. Everything is meaningless if you're not in my life." For a moment, Amara felt trapped in the vortex of his gaze. Her heart pounded, but then she tilted slightly, whispering, "Don't make me believe if you can't keep that promise one day." Adrian didn't answer, only tightened his grip on her hand. A silent vow carved deep. Alexander and Ayla had already prepared a plan when they returned to the living room. First, Alexander said, "We need to track the missing waiter's identity. All traces lead to an underground organization tied to the stock market. They may have tried to seize the White Empire by eliminating its heirs." Ayla added firmly, "But to defeat them, we can't just rely on White Empire's power. We must take another path, find their weakness, overturn the board." Amara looked at the three of them, then nodded. "If this is a battle, then I won't back down. We start from here." 4 hands stacked together beneath the warm golden light, an unspoken vow strong enough to erase all differences of origin, skin color, or distance. The night of New York seemed to fade behind, while in that penthouse, 4 people chose to walk the same road. A road paved with shadows and danger, but also opening the threads of destiny that bound them forever. Sometimes truth reveals power and unveils wounds, desires, and a love that no distance could destroy. The first autumn winds swept through Manhattan, carrying a chill that seemed to seep into the streets and the veins of those bound by secrets too heavy to contain. Inside the penthouse of the White Empire, the 4 of them gathered once more. Adrian and Damian White, heirs of a dynasty cloaked in power, and Amara and Ayla, sisters, whose presence had turned the world of the brothers upside down. Adrian's chest still carried the faint ache of the poison he had narrowly survived. Each breath reminded him of how fragile life could be when shadowed by betrayal. His eyes found Amara's, her gaze steady, filled with an unspoken vow that she would never let him slip away again. And yet, beneath her calm exterior, she trembled at the thought that someone had wanted him gone. Damian leaned forward, his voice taut, slicing through the tension like a blade. "We have a name now," he said. "Edward White." The words dropped heavily, echoing in the silence. Edward, once a familiar figure at family gatherings, the uncle who had always carried a charming smile, who spoke with eloquence and poise, whose advice was laced with honey. To imagine him as the hand behind the poison felt like watching a beloved portrait crack and bleed. Adrian clenched his fists. "He's blood. How could he?" Ayla's soft voice interrupted, though the tremor within it betrayed her composure. "Sometimes blood is the first to betray. It's always those closest who know where to strike deepest." Amara reached across the table, her fingers brushing against Adrian's. That single touch steadied him. She said that the threat isn't just to your lives, if it's truly Edward. It's to everything you've built, everything your family stood for. He isn't working alone. Someone gave him a promise worth his treachery. Damian nodded grimly. The Harringtons. The name alone tasted like venom. The Harrington family had always been the Empire's shadow-old rivals, hungry for dominance that spanned generations. To imagine Edward in their ranks was to imagine a wolf, not merely at the door, but inside the house. That night, Adrian could not sleep. He found himself on the balcony, the city spread beneath him in a wash of lights, each a fleeting star in the chaos of human ambition. Amara joined him, her presence soft but grounding. She draped a blanket over his shoulders to shield him from more than the cold. She murmured, "You look like you're carrying the whole empire's weight on your chest." "Maybe I am," he replied bitterly. "Edward raised me when father was too busy. He taught me to hold a glass of wine without trembling and read the room before entering it. And now, he wants me dead." Amara turned his face toward hers, her dark eyes reflecting not pity, but resilience. "What he taught you doesn't vanish because he's betrayed you. You are not defined by his treachery, Adrian. You are determined by how you fight back." The words struck him more profoundly than he expected. He wasn't a billionaire heir burdened by a family empire for a moment. He was simply a man who wanted to believe he could protect the woman before him. He reached for her hand, pressing his lips to her knuckles, a silent vow blooming between them. The following day, Damien laid out the strategy. His sharp mind worked like an architect of war, mapping Edward's move and every danger corridor. "We can't confront him directly," Damien said. "Not yet. He'll bury himself deeper into the Harrington alliance if we show our hand too soon. We need proof, irrefutable proof, before we strike." Ayla, sitting beside him, tilted her head thoughtfully. Her quiet intelligence had begun to reveal itself more each day, like a hidden river breaking through stone. Proof means infiltration. Someone has to get close enough to him, close enough to the Harringtons to see the heart of their plan. Adrian looked at her, then at Amara. His protective instinct flared immediately. "Not either of you. It's too dangerous." But Amara met his gaze firmly, her chin lifting in defiance. "Adrian, you nearly died because of him. This isn't just your war. It's ours. Don't shut us out." The silence stretched taut between them, heavy with unspoken fear and love. Finally, Adrian exhaled, conceding with a reluctant nod. "Then we moved together. Always together." The deeper they dug, the clearer the picture became. Edward had been funneling information to the Harringtons for months, small leaks at first masked as coincidence, until patterns emerged. Financial trails, coded messages, encrypted meetings. It was a web spun with precision, and at its center was a man who had worn the mask of family. Late in the evening, Ayla discovered a hidden document in one of Edward's old ledgers. It spoke of a planned transition, an elegant word for what was in truth a coup. The White brothers were to be erased one poisoned heart at a time, until Edward could claim leadership and hand the empire's keys to the Harringtons. Her hands shook as she handed the papers to Damien. He read them in silence, his jaw tightening with every line. "This isn't just betrayal," he whispered. "It's slaughter wrapped in silk." Ayla touched his arm, her warmth an anchor. "Then we won't let it happen." In that moment, Damien looked at her not as an ally, but as something far more dangerous to his heart. She had become his calm in the storm, and though he would never admit it aloud, the thought of her in Edward's crosshairs filled him with a fury he had never known. For Adrian and Amara, the days blurred into nights of plotting and fear. Yet even in the midst of danger, their bond deepened. He found himself watching her laugh softly at Ayla's wit, or listening to the steadiness of her voice when the rest of them faltered. She was not born into his world of marble and steel, but she carried herself as though she had been meant to stand beside him all along. Adrian pulled her close one night as the rain lashed against the windows. "If something happens to me," she pressed her palm to his lips before he could finish. Don't speak as though you've already lost. I didn't fight to save your life to hear you throw it away with words." He kissed her then, not with the desperation of a man clinging to survival, but with the reverence of someone finally finding his reason to live. The plan to expose Edward took shape slowly, like a dangerous melody. They would let him believe his schemes remained hidden, while they gathered allies in the shadows, old friends of the family loyalists who had not bent to Harrington gold. But danger crept closer. A car followed Amara one evening after she left the hospital, its headlights cutting too close too long. Damien intercepted a coded message hinting at a second attempt on Adrian's life. And Ayla began receiving anonymous calls, the silence on the other end more terrifying than words. The net was tightening, yet so was their resolve. After hours of chasing leads one evening, they returned to the penthouse exhausted. Adrian poured himself a drink, the amber liquid trembling in the glass. "We're walking on the edge of a blade," he muttered. Damien stood by the window, his silhouette rigid against the night. "We're not just fighting Edward. We're fighting the ghosts of our own family. The weight of a dynasty that was built on loyalty. Loyalty," he shattered. Amara stepped closer to Adrian, resting her hand over his. "Then it's time to rebuild. Not the empire your uncle wants, not the one the Harringtons hunger for, but one forged in truth with all of us." Her words lingered in the room, sinking into their bones. For the first time, the fight wasn't just about survival. It was about choosing what kind of legacy they would leave behind. And though betrayal shadowed their every step, a light had begun to burn between them, a fragile luminous hope that even treachery could not extinguish. The evening sun melted into the horizon, painting the estate gardens with a palette of gold and crimson. The world seemed to hold its breath as Amara and Ayla walked hand in hand beneath the whispering oaks, but the serenity in nature could not conceal the storm brewing within their families. The White family had called for a gathering, formal tents cloaked in the kind of civility that only sharpened the edges of unspoken judgment. Richard White sat at the head of the table, his silvered hair gleaming beneath the chandelier. Once proud and softened by paternal affection, his eyes now hardened with a conviction that chilled Amara. Beside him, elegant in her pearl gray gown, Elizabeth White carried herself with the composure of nobility, though her words struck sharper than any blade. "This union," Richard began, his voice steady and unyielding, "is not one we can condone. It does not fit our name, legacy, or the world we move in." Elizabeth's gaze lingered on her daughter, a flicker of sorrow woven into disdain. "Love is not blind, Amara. It is judged, and judged harshly. Skin bloodlines standing, they matter. You may think your heart is strong enough to endure, but the world will crush you for it." Amara's breath caught the words lashing against her chest. She had prepared herself for resistance, but the cruelty of hearing her love dismissed as unworthy was more cutting than she had imagined. Across the table, Ayla sat upright, her shoulders squared, though her heart raced beneath her calm exterior. She refused to bow her head, though every look thrown her way carried the weight of centuries of prejudice. She clasped Amara's hand beneath the table, a silent vow of strength. "I don't need your acceptance," Ayla said softly, but her voice rang with quiet fire. "What we have is not diminished by your fears. What we share is not dictated by bloodlines or skin." Richard's hand struck the table, the crystal glasses trembling. "You presume too much, Miss Robinson. You come from modest means. Your family's name carries no weight in power circles, and now you dare to entangle my daughter in scandal. Do you understand the cost?" Silence fell thick and suffocating. Amara wanted to speak, to defend, but her throat tightened under the gaze of her parents. She felt torn between the family who had shaped her and the woman who had claimed her heart. At the same time, in the Robinson household, the air carried a different weight, one of protectiveness laced with dread. Michael Robinson. Ayla's father listened quietly as his wife Diane tried to mask her trembling voice. "I see how Amara looks at her," Diane whispered, her eyes glistening. "It is real. It is deep. But love like this has always been punished in worlds that were not ready for it." Michael's jaw tightened. He was a man who had built his life on hard work and dignity and faced his own share of prejudice. He admired Amara's courage and adored the light she brought into his daughter's eyes. But he knew the world outside their home was not so forgiving. He said that if they choose each other, his tone was weighted. We must stand with them. But we cannot shield them from the stones the world will throw. That is what terrifies me. Ayla's younger brother Jordan leaned against the doorway, his arms folded. They shouldn't have to prove their love to anyone. But if they do, I'll fight beside them. No one gets to tell my sister she's not worthy. Days turned into nights, and the divide between families grew sharper. Invitations were rescinded. Whispers traveled through boardrooms and drawing rooms, through dinner parties, where glasses of wine accompanied venom-laced speculation. Amara and Ayla became the subject of murmurs, reckless, defiant, doomed. And yet, in the quiet of their stolen moments, they built a sanctuary only they could understand. One evening, beneath the ancient archways of the Robinson Vineyard, they found solace. The vines, heavy with ripening grapes, swayed in the warm breeze. Lantern light glowed across Ayla's face as she turned to Amara. "Do you ever wonder," Ayla asked, her voice trembling despite her strength, "if it would be easier to walk away, to save you from the hurt they promised to unleash?" Amara shook her head, her eyes fierce. "Every day I wonder. And every day I decide again that I would rather face their hatred than lose you. I cannot, will not pretend that what we have is anything less than fate." Tears glimmered in Ayla's eyes, not of weakness, but of the unbearable beauty of being chosen despite the storm. She leaned into Amara's embrace, her heart pressed against the only truth she trusted. But the White family was relentless. Richard summoned Amara late one night to his study, where the air smelled of leather-bound books and old whiskey. He poured himself a drink, his hands steady, his voice measured. "You are my daughter," he said, not looking at her, "and everything I have built will one day be yours. But if you continue down this path, you will lose it all: wealth, status, even your name. Do you understand?" Amara met his gaze, her own voice trembling but unbroken. "Then, let it all go. What is wealth without love? What is a name if it demands, 'I deny myself'?" Richard's face darkened, his jaw clenching. "Then you are no daughter of mine." The words shattered the silence like glass. Amara stood, her body shaking, but her spirit alight with an unshakable truth. She left the study without a backward glance, her heart both heavy and free. News of the confrontation spread quickly, and the hostility surrounding them intensified. The Harrington family, sensing opportunity, whispered offers of alliance to Edward White. They said, "Your niece has brought disgrace, but power can still be salvaged if you stand apart from her." Edward, greedy and cunning, listened, and in the shadows he began weaving plans to turn family betrayal into advantage. Amidst the chaos, Amara and Ayla stood at a crossroads. Their love had ignited a war between bloodlines, a fire threatening to consume everything they held dear. One evening, beneath the fading light of dusk, Ayla spoke the question that had haunted them both. Do we walk away for peace, or do we fight for love? Amara's hand found hers, fingers entwining as though the universe had bound them together. Her answer came not in words alone, but in the steady certainty of her gaze. If love is the battle, then I choose to fight, with you, always. And the two women found their strength in that vow, fragile yet unbreakable. The world outside could rage, families could divide, and legacies could crumble. But between them, love stood unyielding, like the last light of day refusing to bow to night. The city was wrapped in its usual veil of dusk, skyscrapers catching the last shimmer of light before surrendering to the night. Inside a modest apartment, lit by the quiet hum of a single lamp, Ayla sat hunched over files, her eyes sharp with focus. She had followed the trail for weeks, piecing together fragments of surveillance footage, confidential records, and whispers gathered in back alleys. At last, the evidence was evident, undeniable, and deadly. The poison that had nearly stolen Adrian's life bore the fingerprints of Harrington Corporation. Ayla leaned back, exhaling slowly, as if the weight of her discovery threatened to crush her lungs. She wasn't just a police officer anymore, a soldier standing at the front line of a war far beyond justice and legality. This was personal. Adrian's pale face, his body fighting for breath on that hospital bed, was seared into her memory. The door creaked open behind her. Amara stepped in the weariness of hospital corridors, still clinging to her white coat. Her dark eyes softened when they met Ayla's. Yet beneath the tenderness was a resolve forged in fire. "You found something," Amara whispered, her voice a thread of certainty rather than a question. Ayla pushed the file forward. "It's Harrington. The compound isn't common, it was engineered. Only one laboratory in this city has the infrastructure to produce it, and that lab belongs to Edward Harrington's empire." Amara tightened her grip on the folder, her knuckles whitening. Then it's true. The toxin in Adrian's bloodstream wasn't random or an accident. It came from their hidden vaults. Her medical expertise confirmed that the substance was not found in commercial or legal pharmacopoeia. And now, Ayla had unearthed the direct link. Two halves of a puzzle sliding into place. For a long moment, silence filled the room. Outside, the city thrummed with its oblivious life, unaware that two women stood at the edge of detonating one of the largest scandals in the country. The following evening, they gathered in Alexander's penthouse. The air was urgent, but the luxurious suite seemed like a fitting battlefield headquarters. Though still recovering, Adrian sat upright, his presence calm yet commanding. Alexander stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, hands tucked in his pockets, steel blue eyes reflecting the city lights. Ayla laid the evidence on the glass table. "This is what we have. Enough to bring the Harringtons down." Amara followed, placing her reports beside Ayla's. "And this is the medical proof. The compound's molecular signature matches samples traced back to Harrington's secret lab. No other facility could have created it." Alexander finally turned his gaze, shifting between them. "Then it's time we stop defending and start striking. The Harringtons believed they could silence us, manipulate the narrative, and bury Adrian while seizing control. They underestimated our resolve." Adrian's voice carried the quiet strength of a man reborn from near death. "We strike not just for revenge, but to ensure they can't destroy anyone else. Their power has thrived in the shadows. It's time the world sees who they truly are." The four formed an unlikely alliance: a cop, a doctor, a businessman, and his brother. Yet in that moment, their differences dissolved into a single purpose. At Harrington Towers, Edward reclined in his leather chair, sipping scotch, as his aides reported the latest numbers. On paper, Harrington Corporation still gleamed untouchable profits, soaring deals, secured reputation polished. Yet Edward felt a subtle unease prickling at the back of his mind. Whispers had begun to circulate. Investors are asking cautious questions, journalists sniffing too close to restricted files. And somewhere in the city, Alexander White was stirring. Edward smirked, convincing himself it was nothing more than futile noise. Still, his hand tightened on the glass. He knew the poison had been sloppy, a desperate move born of arrogance. If proof existed, no. He dismissed the thought. The Harringtons had erased stronger enemies before. They would erase these too. The first strike came not in a courtroom, but in the press. Overnight articles surfaced citing leaked medical analyses from a credible hospital source. Though Amara's name was hidden, the details were precise. Adrian White had been poisoned, and the substance bore hallmarks of corporate-grade engineering. Simultaneously, Ayla had ensured the leak of security footage showing Harrington operatives entering the lab late at night. The public, once blind, now tasted scandal. Stock markets wavered. Investors hesitated. Harrington's empire trembled at the edges. Alexander convened a press conference standing before flashing cameras with Adrian. Calm, deliberate, he spoke not with anger, but with the gravity of a man unveiling truth. The attempt on my brother's life was no accident. Evidence points directly to the Harrington Corporation, a conglomerate long hidden behind wealth and influence. We will pursue justice, not only for Adrian, but for every life endangered by their corruption. The words reverberated across media channels, shaking boardrooms and households alike. For the first time, the Harringtons were named openly. The illusion of invincibility cracked. Edward roared with fury when the news broke, his fists slamming against the desk. They dare accuse me. I'll bury them in lawsuits. Smear them until no one remembers their names. But Elizabeth White's voice echoed in Alexander's memory, chilling yet unshakable. His parents had doubted him before, scorned his choices. Now even they sat silently watching the truth unfold on screens they could no longer ignore. Yet doubt flickered within the alliance. Ayla feared retaliation from within the force. Harrington's influence ran deep in the police hierarchy. Amara worried about her hospital career, whispers already circling that she had overstepped professional boundaries. One night, as the city lay in quiet darkness, Amara pressed her forehead against Ayla's shoulder. What if they succeed in destroying us? Not just our names, but us. Ayla. Ayla wrapped her arms around her, her whisper steady despite the storm. Then at least we go down fighting. And if love can survive bullets and poison, it can survive their lies. The trial unfolded beneath glaring lights and packed chambers. Journalists filled every corner, their pens ready to carve history. Edward Harrington sat flanked by his attorneys, his expression cool, but his eyes burning with restrained rage. Ayla took the stand first. Her testimony was precise. Every fact aligned with the evidence she had risked her career to gather. Screens displayed footage of Harrington operatives and documents signed under Edward's directive. Then Amara stepped forward. Calm yet resolute, she explained the molecular structure of the toxin and the impossibility of its originating anywhere but Harrington's clandestine lab. Her words painted science as truth, irrefutable and damning. Finally, Alexander addressed the court, his voice resonant. This is not merely about my brother's life. It is about a system that has allowed corporations like Harrington's to treat human lives as expendable. Today, that ends. The gavel struck. The courtroom trembled with anticipation as the judge's verdict was read. Edward Harrington and his corporation were guilty. The empire collapsed, not with a whisper, but a resounding crash, sending shockwaves through the industry. When the dust settled, the city seemed lighter, like its skyline exhaled after years of suffocation. Ayla and Amara stood outside the courthouse, their hands entwined. Their fight had never been just about law or medicine. It had been about love, about proving that unity could dismantle even the darkest empires. Adrian, healthier and stronger, smiled at his brother. We didn't just win a case, Alex. We proved that some things, truth, loyalty, love, can't be bought. Alexander's gaze shifted to the two women who had risked everything. His voice was quiet, but filled with reverence. And sometimes, the strongest warriors don't carry swords or wear suits. They heal, they protect, they love. That's how empires fall. The four of them, bound not by blood, but by choice, walked away into the evening light. Behind them, the ruins of Harrington's legacy smoldered. Ahead lay a horizon untainted by fear. And though battles would always exist in the world, they had discovered a truth indestructible. When love stands with justice, no power can extinguish it. The courtrooms that once echoed with silence now thundered with the collapse of power. Edward Harrington, The man who had believed himself untouchable stood shackled before justice. His empire crumbled brick by brick under the weight of evidence Ayla and Amara had unearthed. The Harrington name, once synonymous with wealth and influence, now burned as a cautionary tale in every headline. For the first time in decades, the world exhaled. The poison of lies had been purged, and truth, sharp and relentless, had triumphed. Yet, amidst the chaos of downfall, another story quietly blossomed, a tale not of betrayal, but love that refused to bow. The White Estate had been a fortress of tradition, guarded by generations of pride. For months, Alexander's parents had watched silently, convinced that Adrian's presence in their son's life was a fleeting rebellion. But truth has a way of dissolving illusions. Eleanor White sat by her window one night, the moonlight painting her face with silver. She had seen Adrian's devotion, how he shielded Alexander from danger and loneliness. She had seen Ayla's fire, her relentless pursuit of justice, not for glory, but for love. Slowly, Eleanor's heart bent. Perhaps love was not meant to follow rules carved by ancestors. Maybe it was intended to create new ones. When Charles White finally spoke, his voice was weary, but softened. Alexander, you fought battles I never dared to fight in all my years. If he is the man who makes you stronger, then I have no right to stand in your way. It was not surrender, but recognition. Love had proven itself stronger than legacy. Time has a strange tenderness. It stitches wounds so delicately that one forgets where the scars once were. A year later, the world no longer spoke of Harrington's empire. Instead, whispers turned toward the White Estate, where a wedding unlike any other was about to unfold. Two couples, two vows, two destinies. The gardens were transformed into a dream, a sea of white roses and crystal lights swaying in the evening air. Guests arrived in gowns that shimmered like constellations in tuxedos, sharp enough to carve silence. Yet the true spectacle was not the grandeur of the ceremony, but the way love radiated from the two couples at its heart. Alexander adjusted his cufflinks, his reflection in the mirror betraying a rare vulnerability. Adrian stepped behind him, fingertips brushing against his shoulder. Nervous, Adrian teased his smile a quiet anchor. Alexander replied, "Only about you saying no at the last moment," but his voice trembled with reverence, not fear. Elsewhere, Ayla helped Amara pin the final rose into her hair. "You saved lives," Ayla whispered, "but today, you're mine to protect." Amara's eyes softened, the weight of every trial melting into something pure. As the music began, the two couples walked side by side, the aisle stretched like a ribbon of fate before them. The air shimmered with expectation. Vows were exchanged beneath an arch of roses, words woven not only with promises, but with history, the battles they had fought, the scars they had carried, the future they now dared to claim. There was no hesitation when Alexander slipped the ring onto Adrian's finger. When Amara said yes, her voice rang like a hymn. The crowd erupted, but for the couples, the world had narrowed to just them, their love breath and eternity. The reception was a tapestry of laughter and music. Wine flowed like rivers, and the stars seemed to bow lower, eager to witness what destiny had orchestrated. Families mingled, once divided, now bound by something far more substantial than bloodlines. Adrian danced with Eleanor White, who held him with a tenderness that spoke of acceptance. Charles, stiff at first, raised a toast that surprised even himself. "To love," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "the only empire worth building." Ayla and Amara swayed in each other's arms, the world blurring into the soft rhythm of violins. Alexander and Adrian shared a kiss beneath the lanterns, unapologetic, fearless. For one night, everything cruel the world had tried to carve into them was erased. Only joy remained. Months later, As spring breathed new life into the gardens, fate revealed its final hand. Amara was the first to discover it. In the quiet of her clinic, her trembling fingers clutched a small piece of paper that changed everything she was carrying. Twins. Ayla laughed, until she cried, holding her close, whispering that destiny clearly had a sense of humor. Across the city, Adrian nearly dropped the glass he was holding. When Alexander told him the news they too were expecting, twins carried through surrogacy. Adrian's knees buckled, but Alexander caught him laughing and crying. It was as though fate had whispered, your battles were fought for more than yourselves. Your love will multiply. Your legacy will endure. The twins' christening was held in the same garden where the weddings occurred. White roses bloomed again this time, not for vows, but for new beginnings. 4 infants, wrapped in silken blankets, lay in the arms of the two couples who had defied everything to stand here. Alexander gazed at Adrian, the weight of their journey reflected in his eyes. We thought destiny tried to break us, he said softly. But perhaps it was always leading us here. Amara placed her hand over Ayla's, whispering, love doesn't end with us. It begins again in them. The families gathered, no longer bound by prejudice, but by laughter that echoed like music. The Harringtons were gone, but love had built something indestructible, eternal. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting gold across the estate, it was clear this was no ordinary ending. It was a beginning, one destined to ripple through time. Love had faced poison, betrayal, and legacy, yet it had not only survived, it had multiplied. And as the children cooed in their parents' arms, the garden seemed to whisper to every soul present, love will always find a way. Destiny will always bend for it. If this story moved you, let it remind you, true love knows no boundaries, no walls, no impossible odds. Share this tale. Carry it in your heart and never stop believing that love, your love, can rewrite destiny itself.